As we're more likely to do behind.
Yeah.
Office though.
Good morning, everyone. This time it works. So I'd like to all officially welcome you to our Friday conference. We have the pleasure of having Professor Moya Lloyd with us from the University of Essex, giving a presentation on women in management positions in academia. We're very much looking forward to hearing your presentation today. She will be introduced by Professor Alison Martin, who we have with us as well. Just a few technical remarks off the bat. If you need an interpretation into all of the respective languages here that are represented on the booths, just select the channel that corresponds to the language you would like to listen to. If you, for example, if somebody asks a question in Italian and you don't understand Italian, you will go to booth 25 to get our relay into German. Our speaker will be listening to booth 20, where she will be getting her English interpretation. We'll be starting today off with an introduction of the speaker, which will be consecutively interpreted, and then we will hear her presentation, and that will be followed by a question and answer round. Without further ado, I'd like to hand the floor over to Alison Martin. If there are no questions, which there appear not to be, so thank you very much, Professor Martin.
Thank you very much, Colette, and welcome from me to Professor Moya Lloyd from the University of Essex in Great Britain. She's been employed there as Professor in the Department of Government since 2018. Prior to that, she worked for over a decade as Professor of Political Theory at the University of Loughborough, and her main research interests lie in political thought, critical theory, democracy, and diversity. Particularly over the last 2 decades, she's been focusing on the role that women play in political and gender theory. I'm thinking in particular here of her work on Julia Kristeva and Judith Butler. And in this connection, she's been thinking about the relationship between gender, feminism, power, and politics. And she's published an extensive number of edited volumes, monographs, and articles in peer-reviewed journals, as well as chapters on precisely these areas of scholarship. The timely and relevant nature of her research has also meant that she's involved in a number of working groups, including the Centre for the Advancement of Women in Politics, based at Queen's University Belfast, where she acted as Deputy Director. According to its website, the Centre aims to foster an appreciation of women's contribution to politics, government, and public decision-making in the UK and Ireland. It considers women's political participation as having 2 important dimensions: the proportion of women in decision-making and the inclusion of women's perspectives in government policies and programmes. At the heart of the Centre's work is a focus on maintaining a record of women's involvement in public leadership. The initial aims of the Centre were to provide regularly updated figures on women in parties, government, parliament, and local government in the UK and Ireland, with the hope of extending this to other important decision-making sites. Women as decision-makers in academia. This is also a key area in which Professor Lloyd has played an active role over the past 2 decades. At the University of Loughborough, she was head of a department in the School of Social, Political and Geographical Sciences, a role which involves managing people and resources, fostering research and the development of academic programmes within the department, and longer-term strategy and planning. More recently, she's been Executive Dean at the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Essex. These kinds of senior management positions typically involve liaising with the university's academic council and its senior management groups, contributing to university strategic planning and direction, and participating in a variety of university-wide committees. It seems to me then that Professor Moya Lloyd is eminently well placed to talk on today's subject of women in management positions in UK universities. Fortunately for us, she's currently on sabbatical, which enables her to be here in Germersheim during term time. Professor Lloyd, we're very grateful to you for finding the time to come and talk to us in our Friday Interpreting Conference series. Thank you very much for being here. We're really looking forward to your talk.
Vielen Dank, Colette. Ich freue mich sehr, die Professorin Moya Lloyd hier willkommen zu heißen, aus der Essex-Universität in Großbritannien. Sie war Professorin im Fachbereich der Regierungspolitik seit dem Jahr 2018. Sie hat auch als Professorin für politische Theorie an der Universität Loughborough gearbeitet. Ihre Hauptinteressen liegen beim politischen Denken sowie kritischer Theorie und Demokratie sowie Diversität. Seit 2 Jahrzehnten beschäftigt sie sich mit der Rolle der Frau in der Politik und auch in der Geschlechtstheorie. Sehr wichtig ist es hierbei die Arbeiten von Julia Kristeva und Judith Butler zu erwähnen. Sie forscht über Geschlechter, über Feminismus, Macht und Politik. Sie hat sehr viele Artikel veröffentlicht in verschiedenen Zeitschriften über genau diese Bereiche. Ihre relevante Forschung beinhaltet auch die Arbeit in Arbeitergruppen im Center for the Advancement of Women in Politics, also zur Förderung von Frauen in der Politik. Das Ziel ist es, die Wertschätzung von den Beiträgen der Frauen zu erhöhen und zu fördern. Es gibt nämlich zwei wichtige Dinge in diesem Bereich. Zum einen der Anteil der Frauen bei wichtigen Entscheidungen und der Einbezug von Frauen, von der Sichtweise von Frauen, von der Perspektive von Frauen in der Regierung, in der Politik und auch in verschiedenen Programmen. Im Herzen des Zentrums ist die Frau als Teil der Regierung. Zuerst war das Ziel dieses Zentrums, mehr Frauen einzubringen in verschiedene Parteien oder anderen Regierungsprogrammen. Frauen als Entscheidungsträger in der Akademie. Frau Professor Lloyd spielt eine sehr aktive Rolle in diesem Bereich. Sie war auch die Leiterin im Bereich für soziale Politik sowie geografische Wissenschaften. Dort unterstützte sie die Forschung und auch die Entwicklung von akademischen Programmen. Sie war auch leitende Dekanin für Sozialwissenschaften an der Universität Essex. Dann muss sie normalerweise auch viel mit dem akademischen Rat besprechen. So leistet sie auch ihren Beitrag für die Planung in verschiedenen Komitees an der Uni. Ich finde, Professor Lloyd ist die beste Person, um über dieses Thema heute zu reden, nämlich Frauen in Managementpositionen an Universitäten in Großbritannien. Sie hat glücklicherweise ein Semester frei und kann deswegen auch heute hier sein. Ich bin sehr dankbar dafür, dass sie sich die Zeit nehmen konnte, um heute hier auf der Konferenz zu sprechen, und ich freue mich auf ihre Rede. Vielen Dank.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the very generous introduction. So I thought I would start by saying something about my own experience of senior management. As Alison's already mentioned, I was head of department at Loughborough University for a year, and then took up the post of executive dean at Essex. I was the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, which is the biggest faculty at the university. I was responsible for 8 academic departments, and this included the business school, which is the largest department in the university. So it was quite a large job. As executive dean, there are 3 executive deans at the university, and each of us were members of the university steering group, which is the executive leadership team of the institution, which is responsible for the daily running of the university, for drawing up policy, and for making decisions about student recruitment, staff recruitment, and so on. I've listed some of my responsibilities in the role, and these are the key ones. The university has a strategy, which it's the role of the executive dean to implement. The university strategy includes an education strategy and a research strategy. And so it was my responsibility to make sure that these were implemented at faculty level. I was also charged with oversight of, or responsibility for the financial and resource allocation within the faculty. So departments would be given a budget, but if they wanted to spend it in different ways, I would have to approve that. I had funds of my own as executive dean to spend on research or education and so on. Was also had the role of overseeing the annual planning process. So each department would draw up an annual plan, and these would then be discussed at meetings with departments, and decisions would be made about whether they're on the right course, whether changes were needed. Annual planning was also the time for departments to request extra funding for new posts. Academic staff recruitment in the faculty was another one of my main responsibilities. I had to chair interview panels, and in the 3 years that I was executive dean, I appointed over 120 permanent members of staff. So that's quite a big part of the role. Monitoring departmental performance was another factor. So performance in education, performance in research, performance in terms of recruitment of students. You know, were departments getting sufficient students in a particular area? I also had to chair faculty steering group, and faculty steering group brought together the heads of department. I had 3 deputy deans, so they were also part of it, and we would discuss how some of the university decisions were to be carried out at the faculty level. And then my final sort of main role was to manage the heads of departments and the faculty senior team. So that included faculty deans for education, for research and for postgraduate study, and then faculty manager. So that's my experience. But I'd like to talk a little bit about the situation in the United Kingdom and to sort of set this into context. So the figures are from different years. Some are from 2021, some are from 2018. But this gives you an overview of where women are within senior leadership in UK higher education. So 43% of all academic staff are female. The figure below, 49%, of full-time staff, is of everybody, academic and non-academic staff in universities. And you can see from that as well that women make up 66% of part-time staff. So again, academic and non-academic. So there are many more women in universities who are not in academic roles. As of 2018, and I don't think the figure has changed very much, 29% of the sort of the chief executive, I've called them, but in England we talk about the vice chancellor mainly. Some institutions in Scotland have principals or rectors, but 29% of them are female. 37% of the senior or executive teams are made up of women. Now, Essex was a bit unusual in that there were over half of the senior executive team, the university steering group, were female. And I can say more about that if you've got questions later. The interesting one, because it doesn't seem to change very much, is the next one. Academic heads. Universities in the UK are organised slightly differently. Some have departments, some have schools, some have faculties. So the heads of those different units, 31% are female. And that hasn't changed since 2016. And it may be partly, and I'll come back to this, to do with how they are recruited, because often heads of department are chosen from within the department, and that means that, you know, new blood isn't brought in from outside. Yeah. And then 28% of professors in the UK are female. And I believe 1% are black or Asian, so much lower figures. Professors, in this sense, exclude those who are not heads of department. So that's the way the figure is calculated. So women are not appearing in senior roles as frequently as you might expect from the number that there are within academic life. And I thought this was quite an interesting way to sort of look at what happens. The purple are female, the orange is male, and if you look, you can see that undergraduates women make up 56% roughly, and men just under 44%. But by the time it switches to the other end of the pipeline, men make up 72% of professors and women about 28%. So this is from 2019-20. So the numbers start to decline when moving towards research degrees. And a research degree is usually a prerequisite of an academic career. And then it declines further as we go towards all academic staff, and then much further by the time we get to professors. And often institutions will spend quite a lot of time analysing this data to try and find solutions to this decline. And I can say more about that later. So why? Why are there fewer women in these roles at the most senior levels? Well, one is that being a professor is normally a prerequisite for a senior management position. And if women only make up 28% of the professoriate, there are fewer available for these senior roles. Head of department can be slightly different in that you could be the grade below professor to take on a head of department role. I mean, in the UK, we talk about senior lecturers and readers. I don't know what the equivalent is. It isn't. Okay. But you'd have to be at least what we call a senior lecturer. So this is somebody that has been promoted. But I think perhaps more, so that's one factor that we can't escape. But new vacancies are often filled by people who are already in a senior position. So at Essex, for example, we have a vice-chancellor, a deputy vice-chancellor, 2 pro-vice-chancellors, and then the executive deans. And what often happens is somebody who is a pro-vice-chancellor will move to a job as a deputy vice-chancellor somewhere else. Somebody who has been a deputy vice-chancellor might move to be a vice-chancellor, and vice-chancellors move around the system. So the person that was at Essex before the current vice-chancellor, I believe, is now at Cardiff. So, it's one of the oddities of this kind of role that once you've been in a senior position, you do get contacted about these vacancies that arise. And I'll say more about that shortly. Gender stereotypes. It's often, I think, there are assumed that there are particular qualities that one has to have in order to be a leader. And those qualities are often associated with masculinity. So we might think of them as masculine qualities. It could be assertiveness, it could be decisiveness, single-mindedness, and so on. And so this feeds through into the next 2 points on the PowerPoint, because one thing that frequently happens is that women don't apply for some of these posts because they don't feel that they fit the job description. Right? Don't feel that they've got the necessary qualities, perhaps, to take on this sort of responsibility. But also, women don't apply often because they don't feel like they meet every single one of the criteria. When I was earlier in my career, I went to an event focused on women and leadership, where it was claimed that women tend to apply for promotion when they meet all the criteria, whereas men, and it's a bit binary, but men will tend to apply when they meet, say, a third of them or a half of them. So men are more optimistic quite often about their ability to take on a role. Now, that is not universally true. Some women are much more assertive and confident. Some men are probably a bit more sort of self-doubting. But by and large, I think women often don't apply because they don't fit the job description. And I will tell you that although I ended up as executive dean at Essex, I withdrew from the process earlier in the stage because I didn't think that I met all the criteria. Okay. I think the other factor that's relevant is something called unconscious or implicit bias in recruitment and selection. So these are the biases that we have possibly without being aware of them. So it's not when we are deliberately prejudicial, it's when we may make assumptions without thinking, or we may behave in a particular kind of way without thinking. And so an example that always stands out for me is that in a meeting, a woman might say something, put forward a suggestion, and it not be commented on. Later on in that meeting, somebody else, male, puts forward the same suggestion, and people think that's a really good idea. It may be that this unconscious bias also works in terms of, thinking, well, in a personal sense, well, I can't do this job, I'm not right for it, because you need to have these sorts of qualities. So sometimes we find that this is allied with gatekeeping, that these unconscious or implicit biases mean that people don't recruit those who don't fit, those who are perhaps look a bit different or sound a bit different. So those might explain why men may tend, male vice chancellors may tend to recruit other men to senior positions. Clearly doesn't always happen, but these are explanations that have been put forward for why there are fewer women. So, what might we do to address the imbalance? Well, we can look at the criteria that we use for promotion, because obviously, if the expectation is you need to be a professor before you can take on one of these roles, then we want to make sure that women are becoming professors at a comparable rate to men. But also in terms of the recruitment and selection process. So when the job advertisement goes out, when the person specifications are used, so in the UK we will list the sorts of personal qualities that one needs. We also use a job description which explains what the job does and what are essential criteria. So we can look at those sorts of processes and try and gender proof them. In other words, to look for the implicit biases, to look for, obvious stereotypes, anything that might discriminate against women. And one thing that has been implemented in a number of institutions is that unconscious or implicit bias training has to be completed before you can engage in recruitment. So in order to be on an interview panel, for example, one must have gone through unconscious or implicit bias training, which is really just about trying to make us aware of some of the assumptions we might make, and therefore to try and counter them. There's also some evidence that the use of executive search firms can help to diversify the pool of candidates. So that's going to an external company and asking them to draw up lists of potential candidates for a post. And so that's how I ended up being interviewed for the role of executive dean. The job was advertised. I didn't apply for it. I'd been head of department for 1 year, didn't think I fit. Was contacted by an executive search company who talked to me about the role and who then put my name forward. I then had to apply in the usual way, but it's an encouragement to do so. So it's somebody external saying, well, we think you have the kinds of qualities that we need. We would encourage you to put in an application. And a lot of the executive search firms are very honest. If they don't believe you meet the criteria, they will say, right, well, this is possibly too early for you, or, But there is evidence to suggest that actively going out and looking for people to invite to apply helps. They then have to go through exactly the same process as everybody else. Their applications are vetted, they are interviewed, and they're treated exactly the same. But it's just that it really does help to actually diversify the pool of candidates. I'm just going to have a sip of water. But I think we also need to think about how we can encourage women to put themselves forward for some of these roles. And so a number of institutions have introduced development training. For example, women in leadership programs. And these programs are available to earlier career researchers. So they are to people earlier in their career, and they're about trying to introduce them to the role of leadership, to show them what's involved, to try and give them some of the skills that they might need. At Essex, we have 2 programs. One is called Future Leaders, which is for people who are at the very beginning of their career, and it's sort of a 5-day course that you attend, and it teaches you about different sorts of skills that you might need. It tells you about the way university processes work. So it tries to make it obvious, to demystify what's happening. And then there is a second programme called Senior Leaders, which is for people who are usually at professorial level, but who may be potential candidates for head of department, for executive dean roles. And they're not for women only, they are for men and women. And they are also for academic and non-academic members of staff. So I did the Senior Leaders programme when I started at Essex, and I was there with senior colleagues from the Students' Union, from the finance department, and so on. But they're useful exercises they're useful sort of ways of introducing people to how things work, and there are usually sort of exercises given so that you can practice certain skills in a sort of safe context. I think one of the things that I benefited from, and a number of universities have introduced, are mentoring programs. Queen's, which Alison mentioned, Queen's University in Belfast, had a women's mentorship scheme where a person was mentored by somebody senior to them, and then, if ideally they would then mentor somebody who was at an earlier stage of career, so that you learned how to mentor from being mentored, and it was very, very useful. And again, it's just really giving a one-to-one opportunity for people to talk through the skills that they've got, but more importantly, what they might need to learn, what they might need to develop, whether there are courses that they could go on that would help them, whether there are roles in a department that they could take up that would give them an initial bit of experience of admin or management. I said admin, British shorthand, administration, just in case. But those are quite useful because they're personalised. It's a sort of it's a one-to-one discussion, and it's very much tailored to the needs of the person in question. And it might be about research, it might be about teaching. It doesn't have to just be about leadership. Coaching. This was something that I was given at Essex, and I'd never had it before. But this was somebody external came in and just talked to me on a one-to-one basis, but really was giving me advice and guidance on how to embrace leadership. And what I found most valuable about that was that what my coach got me to focus on was the skills and qualities that I had, rather than trying to fit into an idea of what a leader was. And she said to me, it's sort of, well, they wouldn't have appointed you if they hadn't believed you could do the role. And that was really important. So this is somebody saying, right, well, they've picked you because of the qualities you already have, rather than this is what you need to, you need to be like this. But it was also very helpful in terms of thinking about different ways of interacting with different kinds of people who might approach leadership, decision-making, and so on, in different ways to me. So how was I going to engage with somebody who makes very quick decisions that, when I might think they needed to take a bit more time, what skills could I learn? So it was very much about how to lead, how to manage, and to skills around that. Final point, I guess, is the setting public targets and reporting on them. Often institutions will set targets to say we want to reduce the gender pay gap. We want to increase the number of women professors. We want to, increase the number of women heads of department. But they don't. Sometimes it's internal to the institution. It's not made public, those kinds of targets. And so I think in the literature, one of the suggestions is by making these targets public and having to report on them, the institution has to demonstrate that it's doing something to address them. Yeah? That it's actually not just saying we want more women in senior leadership and then forgetting to look at how they might actually encourage more women into it. So this may be a kind of a way to help address the imbalance. I mean, one scheme that we have in the UK is called Athena Swan, and it's focused on gender and gender equality, and institutions can apply for different levels of award, bronze, silver and gold. So you can apply for a bronze award on the basis of what you're doing in terms of ensuring that gender is taken seriously in how a department is run or how an institution is run. And so those are kind of public forms of reporting. But I think that's probably enough from me. So thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Professor Lloyd, for that. That gave us a very good insight into what's going on in the British education system. I was wondering if we could take your PowerPoint slide back to the figures. Is that possible? Maybe the slide on with the, okay, thank you. I just wanted to add the German dimension, if I may, and then I've got a couple of questions, and then we'll take questions from the floor, of course. It's always difficult to come up with statistics that are comparable across systems. These are from 2021. Just to give you something for comparison. So in Germany, 54% of general staff, so academic and non-academic staff, are women. 40% are academic staff. And then when it comes to professors, 26%. So we're actually, I don't want to diminish in any way what you've been saying, but in Germany we're actually even further behind Britain when it comes to women in academic and leadership positions. Particularly also if we break it down in terms of subject, in engineering it's 14%, 14, and in the humanities it's 40. So that shows us also quite a stark difference between the sciences and the arts and humanities. So we have similar problems, is the point I'm making here. And my first question has to do with legal frameworks in place to try and ensure that women achieve the kinds of position which you embody, because we've got the hard laws, if you like, and the soft laws. Hard laws in terms of constitutional law, higher education policies at state level and at federal level in Germany, and then also the level of the university itself, which stipulate various things. And then we've got the softer laws, so recommendations, I suppose. I'm thinking about Horizon 2020, or I'm thinking about the EU Gender Action Plan. And I'm wondering what you consider is more effective in trying to get women into these leadership positions and professorial positions at university level. So that's my first question. Perhaps you'd like to answer that, and then I'll come on to my second. Yeah, that's interesting. I think it's actually, I mean, we've probably got a similar breakdown in terms of differences across the different disciplines. And science, I think, is probably lower than, say, arts and humanities, and social science probably somewhere in the middle. You know, I mean, I'm not that old, but I was the first female PhD student at Warwick in politics. So I think, you know, you get that sort of spread. I mean, it's important to have the legal frameworks in place, because it means that institutions have to work within them. But I think a lot of the work is almost at a cultural level, you know, because something is going wrong already when you, when you look at the kind of the breakdown, you know, why are young women not going on to the kind of research postgraduate kinds of careers in the same numbers as men? Why are they then not going into academic careers in the same numbers? I might put my husband on the spot here shortly, if he's listening, because this morning, Andrew, are you with us? Because this morning there was an article in the paper about needing to have
specific sorts of research funding for female scientists, because what was currently available to them wasn't enabling them to take their careers forward. Now, I didn't read the article, which is why I said he might have something to say about it. But I think it's a combination. I'm not sure I can say one is better than the other, but I think a lot of the work is cultural. But it's also about somehow encouraging women to believe that they can do these sorts of things. Now, it's not just women. I mean, I think one thing I'd like to say is that, one of the things that Essex is very focused on, which is very different than Loughborough, where I used to work, is first generation students. So people who are the first people in their families to go to university. It's how you encourage those people, male and female, to carry on with academic careers, when they are very bright and very capable, because it's not within their, perhaps it's not within the sort of vision of themselves that they have. It's not something that they think that they can do. And so I think there's also a race dimension here as well. So it's quite complicated.
If I could just pick up on what you said there about the vision that people have of themselves, what your what this statistical overview seems to show us is there's a tipping point at the sort of research postgraduate stage. But actually, I wonder whether the seeds of this problem are not sown in schools so much earlier on, actually, in women's educational development. Could you say anything maybe about the programs there are in place between universities and schools to try and give young women a vision of themselves, to pick up that term again, of where they could be in 10 and 20 years' time?
I don't. It's an interesting question, because I don't know whether there are any, or at least I don't know of any that focus specifically on sort of girls in school and what. I mean, certainly, I think there's there was something recently in the news about the fewer number of young women who were taking maths at A level. And maths and physics, and the presumption there was that it was sort of too hard and that they weren't interested in it, which caused quite a lot of controversy, because I think the view was, well, actually they are interested, but they're often channeled in different directions, and they're encouraged to do sort of arts, humanities, languages, and not to go into the sort of the hard sciences. So I think you're right about that. I think there's all sorts. There's kind of work on childhood socialization that talks about the language that we use in relation to children. That quite often we say to boys, "You're very clever," and we say to girls, "I don't know, you're very pretty." So we make judgments from kind of quite early on that sort of intelligence is somehow valued more in boys than in girls. And I think so much of it probably depends on the kind of school that you go to. I mean, I was quite fortunate in a way that I went to a school where there was a bit of a conscious effort to think, right, girls can do sciences. So I was encouraged to do sciences. So I did maths, physics, maths, physics, chemistry, and biology. But I was never a scientist. So when I chose for myself, I gravitated to history, French, English, and then into sort of politics. But there was at least an effort there to say this sciences are not just for boys. Whereas my son went to a boys' school, and they were very much geared towards pushing them towards science subjects. He ended up doing philosophy and politics for his degree, so he kind of moved the other way. So I think I agree. I think it does go back further. I think it goes back into childhood, into the choices that people make. And And it's interesting that I think that the programs that have been introduced recently within universities have been around first generation rather than, I mean, there are programs for young women leaders. I can't remember, there's a new scheme that's come forward to try and address some of this. But I think it's interesting. It's believing that you can go on and do some of these things. And not all women do believe that. And I mean, I'm just as guilty of that, it has to be said. Because, as I said earlier, in terms of my own career, I never, ever expected to be an executive dean. It was not something I wanted to do. It was not something I imagined I would do. But I was encouraged, and I think that's kind of quite important, talking about encouragement.
Yep, thank you very much. I'd now like to take questions from the floor, if I may, please.
I would just like to point out to everybody here attending today, if you would like to ask a question to the speaker, you may do so by pressing the right silver button on your microphone. It will then be activated by the technicians at the front. And just a message to our viewers on YouTube today, we'd love to bring you into the conversation as well. So please feel free to write your question in the online chat on YouTube, and we will then ask the question on your behalf. Thank you.
Thank you. And as you have noticed, it will first flush green, and it needs to go red, and then everybody can actually hear you. Thank you so much. This is wonderful and fascinating and very personal, and I am so grateful that you are talking about this and that you invited such a fascinating speaker. I was reminded of a conversation that I had with a friend who always, whenever his daughter is praised for her looks, people will go, "Oh, she's so cute, she's so pretty." And he goes, "Yes, and that's actually the least interesting thing about her." No, so that's such a good answer, because it reduces the girl to exactly only that particular point, and he makes sure to point out there's so much more than just the way she looks. So I've tried to make a point of always answering a similar remark with something like that, and very often people look at me and think I'm being unkind because they are trying to compliment me and my daughter. I'm not sure how they are trying to compliment me by telling me my daughter is pretty. There's also something in there, but still they're trying to be nice, and I tell them that they're doing a terrible thing. So then we get into conversations about gender stereotypes, which may sometimes be productive and sometimes less so. What you just pointed out, I think it is very interesting that girls in school, and this is actually an experience that I've had with my daughter, they are being increasingly not pushed, because that's a negative word, but the path towards science and coding and those things is being deliberately made easier for them. And I very much appreciate that in our own life. My daughter has been offered several, she's 12, but she's been offered several workshops, and right now she's in a program that does astronomy and physics for girls specifically outside of school, and she's had a digital coding thing, and she's always loved it. But this is because I think I live in a community that has the resources to offer that, and that is very linked to a university that has programs that try to get girls in there. And if you don't live in a community like that, then I think it's a very different opportunity. It's a very different situation. And so I think there's an urban versus rural aspect to this as well. If you live in a community that puts emphasis on this and has the resources, then it can go in a different direction. But if the trifactor of where you live, how you look, where you come from, and or actually, another factor, your gender, if those combine, that can really be an issue, I think. And I'm not sure where to start on that one. the actual question that I wanted to ask is, from the introduction, I had the impression that you were also involved or have some experience with the business community, with the political community, and I would be interested in your views on, is there a difference in women in decision-making positions in academia versus in politics versus in the business community? And are there different angles that people take? Is it harder in the academic community? Is it harder in the business community? Is it different in the political community? Or do you say, no, those are actually basically fundamentally the problems are the same?
I suspect I'm going to say the problems are fundamentally the same. No less about the business community as such, but have colleagues who at Essex who work on women and sort of management, women in the business sort of community, and I think are exploring the ways in which it's the same pipeline thing. What happens to women? They go into these careers, but they don't necessarily progress to sort of senior or chief executive levels in the same numbers as men. I mean, they do a lot of work around notions of inclusive leadership. And I mean, I went to a workshop that they ran on sort of inclusive leadership, but inclusive meetings, how you run events in an inclusive way, and what you do. Thinking in terms of your choice of examples that you might use, thinking of the language that you use. And I mean, so they're running those sorts of things for businesses, but this was put on for the university. And I think without needing to translate much, as it were, it was sort of very simple. Politics was interesting because the centre was based in Belfast, so this was in Northern Ireland, at the time of the Good Friday Agreement, so the peace agreement. And the parties in Northern Ireland at that point were very heavily dominated by men. There were female politicians, but primarily male. So they set up a party, the Northern Ireland Women's Party, and they got seats, and they were involved in the peace talks. And I think one of the very first times they attended a meeting, some of the male politicians made mooing noises, cows, as they walked in. Right, so this is 1994. Indicating really that women probably didn't have a place. But they persisted, and actually they were quite successful. But they were primarily, there were a lot of university women involved. And one of the things that we did as a centre for the advancement of women in politics was put on workshops and other events to encourage women from non-traditional backgrounds and non-academic backgrounds. So there were sort of training events on how to go about having a political career. So there were media training sessions, what you might need to do if you were to kind of talk to the media. What were the basic things you needed to learn? We worked. So these events would include sort of women's community groups, because there were a lot of community groups in Northern Ireland through the period of the Troubles, where women were very, very heavily involved. So those community groups were sort of brought together with sort of politicians from the Houses of Parliament. Northern Ireland politicians who were in the Houses of Parliament, councillors and academics, just to share ideas and to sort of exchange ideas. And it was, as somebody who wasn't from Northern Ireland, in some ways it was easier to speak, because I think people were very careful what they said to one another. But it was really fascinating insight just into how difficult it could be for groups from certain areas or certain parts of Northern to be taken seriously and to have a kind of political voice. And I think the Centre did a lot of really interesting work with those kinds of groups, really. And I guess the other thing that happened also in Britain at one point was that it became possible to have all women shortlists, which again, the Labour Party instituted it, and that obviously made a big difference. To actually put in place a measure that was to have a certain proportion of the shortlist for kind of parliamentary candidates to be women only. But lots of the parties didn't want to adopt that because it was perceived as a sort of form of reverse discrimination. But I think it made a difference because I think it just suddenly, the fact, they called them Blair's babes. The British media has a lot to answer for. But I think just seeing women, in a way, in those positions actually encourages others to go forward. So I think, it's a similar kind of thing, changing the culture, having role models, all those sorts of things are important.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais poser ma question en français. Merci beaucoup pour cette présentation très intéressante. J'aurais deux questions en fait. La première question concerne quelque chose dont j'aimerais bien qu'on arrête de parler un jour, le Covid. Est-ce que vous avez remarqué une évolution notable dans le monde académique, à l'université, à cause de la pandémie? Ça serait le premier point. Et pour mon deuxième point, j'aimerais revenir... vous avez mentionné qu'il faudrait un changement culturel plutôt qu'un changement de loi. En France, on remarque en ce moment des débats et des longues discussions sur le féminisme en général et sur ce genre de thématiques telles que l'inégalité salariale, l'accès aux postes à responsabilité, etc. Un débat qui est très animé, je dirais, avec notamment des experts et des linguistiques qui se déchirent sur la question de l'écriture inclusive à peu près tous les 6 mois. Donc j'ai l'impression que on ouvre un petit peu la place publique à ce genre de débat, mais qu'on n'avance pas véritablement. Et du coup, j'aimerais demander votre point de vue sur la société britannique, si vous remarquez des avancées au niveau culturel.
Thank you. Okay, the pandemic. Yes, I think. I guess it's possibly the same as in Germany. We had to move everything online, and I think it quickly became apparent that it was more difficult for some people to do that than others, and some of those were people with caring responsibilities, and typically that is more often than not females. Though it's not exclusively. So we spent quite a lot of time sort of trying to work out how we could streamline the work that people did, to sort of prioritise different areas. And I think to try and accommodate different people's needs. And this impacted on sort of promotion, the promotion sort of schedule. But we also have something in the UK system called probation, or as it's called at Essex, pathway to permanency. But this is basically 3 years when you have you start a new post as a new academic, and you have to fulfil sort of a set of criteria in order to be made permanent. So it's a probation period, typically 3 years, although it can be completed sooner than that if you meet the targets that you've set. And so there are some publication targets, some education targets, basically to attain fellowship of the Higher Education Academy. It's a basic sort of teaching qualification. And then the rest might be some PhD supervision and so on. So obviously the pandemic had an impact on that. So one option that we gave staff was an extra year to complete their tasks if they wanted it. That was optional. They didn't have to take it, but if they wanted extra time for probation, they could take it. The university had to suspend all research leave. So obviously this has an impact on people's publications and so on. So again, in terms of the promotions applications, there was space for people to actually put down the way that COVID had impacted on them. Now, my experience, because I was on academic staffing committee, so that's the committee that looks at the promotions for the entire university for academic staff. We still got the same number of applications broadly, and people still succeeded at about the same rate. So it didn't seem to have a negative impact as such, but clearly people's working lives were deeply affected. And probably still are. I mean, we're not really completely out of it. So I think it probably, it was difficult for everybody, I think, but it certainly meant that research, for those who were on research contracts, time for that was really, really reduced. And that, but I suppose the other thing the UK did, and I guess it's possibly the same, they extended grants. So if people had got a grant, then they could have an extension on it because of COVID. So there was some attempt to compensate. So I don't know, I mean, that's the first question. The second, public debate. Yeah, I think the legal system, there's a kind of general expectation that men and women are treated equally. I think that sort of, it's been in law for quite a long time now. In practice, we still have issues like gender pay gaps. And Essex was unusual in that it took a decision, 5, maybe 7 years ago to raise all female professorial salaries so that the pay gap between men and women at professorial level reduced. So that was a very conscious attempt to try and accommodate that. But there is still a pay gap, and it's published annually, and I believe it's about 18% for Essex at the moment, and it's different amounts for different institutions across the UK, and you can look for businesses as well, and you can see, and some of it, mostly women are worse off than men in terms of salaries, but not always. At some levels, particularly on the professional services side, actually men are earning less than women. So so there are ways in which institutionally, I guess people can apply for additional increments. They can, and those are looked at, and attention is paid to sort of impact on the pay gap and so on in terms of how those are distributed. There hasn't been much of a kind of public debate in the UK around inclusivity and so on for quite a long time. I think there's a lot of, the things that hit the kind of the media are often the sort of wilder stories. British media is not the best. so they have, so it hasn't been a particular topic. I mean, I guess there's a concern to make sure that that there are sufficient women, and the papers will report on, increased numbers of women representatives in Parliament if they think it's kind of beneficial to do so. And they will quite often focus on the fact that X is, Johnson's cabinet or whoever's cabinet has got X number of women in it. So there is some sort of publicity around that. I mean, universities at the moment, the whole debate is around freedom of speech and what's happening there, and what can be said and not said. And I think that's where the sort of public focus is. So it's possibly, I mean, the feminist movement in Britain is maybe less tapped into the kind of the national media in some ways. I mean, some of the feminists whose voices are tend to get the most that appear the most often are not necessarily those at the grassroots. Yeah. I'm not sure that entirely answers your question, but.
Thank you, Professor Lloyd. I found your presentation to be very interesting, to say the least. Couple points I wrote down for myself, and I just would like to ask you two questions. You had mentioned that, pardon me, women take a more perfectionistic approach to applying for jobs. And I read somewhere that the reason women are more perfectionistic, not to lead you in your answer in any way, but the reason why women are more perfectionistic in this regard is because historically, and this would be some sort of like a subconscious vestige of the suffragette times, women had to fight tooth and nail for their right to a seat at the table and prove that they meet the criteria to be there. And I'm wondering if that is a remnant of those times in any way. If not, please give me a different answer. I don't want to lead you in any way. And then my other question pertains to how, from a systemic perspective, we or institutions can encourage, foster the development of women in senior management positions, be it through structural changes, integrated childcare, work from home options, or even just awareness-raising measures to let women know, senior management positions, if you do intend to raise a family, are actually quite attractive because you have the ability to make your own hours, which a 9-to-5, a classic traditional 9-to-5 job, wouldn't enable you to do. So I would be just interested in hearing your perspective on how or what structural changes could be made to facilitate the movement of more women from the less senior roles to the senior management positions in university.
Yeah, interesting. The first point about women tending to feel the need to meet all the criteria. It may well be that you have to, particularly going into certain sorts of areas that you feel that you need to be able to demonstrate unequivocally that you've met all the criteria so that, people can't say, oh, she's there to meet a gender quota or something. So I think it may be partly that. I don't know whether it's also partly just that women take more seriously the idea of the essential criteria, which may again be a sort of something deeply rooted sort of in childhood and early schooling and so on, that they, if it says it's what's required, that's sort of what you aim to do. But certainly I think the idea that you take on one of these roles, I guess you need to feel confident that you fit, and if you're aware of a huge gap, then I guess the kind of the anxiety might be, well, somebody else will notice and they'll be wondering why you got the job if you didn't have X or Y or Z. So I think, you may well be right that it is that, women have had to fight hard to prove themselves, and therefore, one way to do that, to demonstrate that you really do fit the role, is to have, to be able to kind of fulfill every single kind of criteria. I mean, I don't know of any other reason, really. I don't think there's anything else there. In terms of what could be done, yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting to see what the impact of the pandemic is on working, because I think one of the debates that we were having, and I suspect other institutions have been having, certainly business has been having, is about hybrid working. So sometime in the office, sometime away. And I think, I would imagine that the university, particularly for these sorts of leadership roles, or where you're not necessarily required to teach and be on a campus, that there's greater flexibility there around how you sort of organise your day. I mean, my day though was structured 9 to 5. I mean, it was full of meetings. So, you know, you've got to to take on an executive dean role, you have to be available 9 to 5. And when it was face-to-face, it was 9 to 5, and then some evenings, because there would be evening events. So it's not really easily accomplished. I think if you've got a lot of caring responsibilities and so on. I mean, interestingly, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor at the institution has 2 smallish children. And I think once they'd moved to hybrid working, she suddenly realised how little she had been seeing of them and how much she enjoyed sort of spending time with them. So I think that trying to accommodate people from different backgrounds with different sort of life experiences, different responsibilities, probably does mean that you know the institutions need to look at how these jobs operate, the hours that they operate, the amount that's covered by them. I mean, I could quite easily imagine 2 or 3 people doing the job that I did, because there were areas that just took up a lot of time, which you think, well, actually somebody else that could have been devolved into a different role. There could have been a faculty dean, for example, responsible for recruitment, you know. So, but I think there are, I mean, I do think, you know, availability of sort of crashes and things, childcare is important. I mean, it's important to enable women to take on roles, and men as well, because I guess there are men who will have caring responsibilities who will need to sort of to do that. But I think there's something that has to change probably earlier, in terms of when it's almost like you need to introduce people very early on in their academic careers to the idea that these sorts of roles are doable by normal or ordinary people. I mean, one of my joys as executive dean was that I had a dean's list event. So the top students in the year, I'd meet them, and there'd be a sort of celebration. And, you know, one of them said to me, when you were a little girl, did you want to be an executive dean? And I said, when I was a little girl, I had no idea what an executive dean was. You know, I said I was the first person in my family to go to university. So, no, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, do you want to be an executive dean? I'd have said, well, no. And I think it's about demystifying some of these roles, because, you know, once you get into them, you realise, well, yes, you can do them. You know, you use the skill set that you've got and you make it work for you. But I think there's a way in which university hierarchy operates that sometimes these things just seem out of reach. You know, you think it's a special kind of person, or that takes on these sorts of things. Somebody who's very, I don't know, ambitious. Somebody who wants to be sort of in control or have. I don't think it's always that way. You know, I think there's something that needs to happen. You see, I actually don't think people always understand how their own institutions work. And I think we go in and we teach, and we know how that works. We know how the department works. But once you get sort of above the department into maybe the faculty you know a little bit about, but you don't necessarily know what's going on higher up. And I think some of it's about demystifying that. And it's almost like, you know, these roles need to be not advertise to people. I think it's almost like you need to spend a day in the life of the executive team. Just have a look at what they do, learn what's happening. You might decide on the basis of that you don't want to do it ever. You might think, well, actually, I could do that. So I think there does need to be structural change, and I think there needs to be universities do need to look at how they operate and at their expectations about working hours and what people do and how much time they can devote to things. Probably also needs to be time looking at how roles are actually defined. Job sharing might be an option for certain sorts of roles. They're not conceived in that way. They could be. There's probably a lot that could be done to make it more open.
Could I ask a last question and wrap up? Would that be okay? Okay. So education, it seems to me, or I've always felt, is about having the potential to change people's lives or to make them understand how they can change and improve their lives. And I simply wonder whether you felt that you've ended up at the universities where you have, and it's a very rich variety, because you felt that these were the institutions where you could make the greatest difference.
The short answer is no. The longer answer is, it's interesting. Essex, for me, it's very weird. Essex, for me, feels like a home in a way that other institutions haven't. And I think that is partly because it has a very strong commitment to the idea of sort of transformational education. It's an institution that has lots of students who are first generation. It has lots of international students, but it has a lot of students from quite poor backgrounds with family incomes that are sort of around, I don't know what this would be in euros, £25,000 a year, which is, so it doesn't draw from the public or the private school sector as much as some other institutions. So it really does feel that it's a place where you can make a difference to people's lives, or they can make a difference to their own lives. I mean, it's about you opening sort of their eyes to various things and then encouraging them to do it. And I don't think all of the institutions I've worked in have thought in quite those terms, but it's certainly the one that, where I've ended up, I think is, in retrospect, I would love to have been there a lot longer. So I think, yes, it feels like this is somewhere that I could. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I'm guessing we've got no questions from outside, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our interpreters in the Russian booth, the Italian booth, the English booth, the French, the Spanish, the Polish, and the Dutch for their hard work today.
And I'd like to thank our speaker once again, Professor Moya Lloyd. Thank you for your wonderful remarks today. They were very insightful, and speaking for everyone here, we all enjoyed listening to you. We could have gone on for another hour and a half, in my opinion. I just would like to remind everybody that next week we will have another conference on Umweltschutz, FTSK. This will be chaired in German. The presentation will be in German as well, and it will be held by Junior Professor Angela Köhling and chaired by Lisa Marie Katzur and Andrea Boyer.
Thank you.